So welcome everybody. Appreciate you coming on. I know it's getting near to the end of the semester, so I appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight. I'm Dr. Olmsberg. I'm the acting chair of Women's and Gender Studies, I'll introduce everybody else on the panel in just a second. I want to quickly do a commercial for Women's and Gender Studies. So for those of you who don't know much about the department, we're over in Carson Hall, and we're unique in the ways in which we are committed to the interdisciplinary study of women and gender as they relate to issues of sexuality, race, society, and in the way that we do this, we're always sort of looking at knowledge as it pertains to social justice. And so that makes us in some ways very different from more traditional disciplines, because all of the ways in which we explore issues has to do in some ways with this commitment, this broader commitment to social justice, however that might be defined. So if you haven't taken classes in WGS, I encourage you to do so. And on the back table over there, I know you're all signing up for classes next week. There's all the offerings that we have in fall of '09. And I'm going to give a quick plug for two classes, because there are two classes that are not general electives or necessarily explicitly part of the major or minor. And so we want to make sure that they enroll, and they both also happen to be my classes, but I swear that's a pure coincidence. The first one is WGS 255, Introduction to Queer Studies. And this is on Thursdays from 9 to 11:40, and it's 3 units. So I encourage you to think about that. The second one is WGS 301, which in the spring has been, for the last few years, the Queer Studies Lecture Series. But in the fall, we're sort of transitioning it from Women's Health Lecture Series that it's been in the past to being a Feminist Lecture Series that's going to be locally and regionally grounded in terms of the speakers that are brought in. And unlike the Queer Studies Lecture Series, which has speakers basically every week throughout the semester, only half of the weeks are going to have speakers brought in, so that in the other weeks, people can break into small groups and have dialogues about the speakers who come to sort of represent a feminist pedagogy more honestly. So that is Thursdays from 12 to 12:50, and it's 1 unit credit, no credit. So it's a great way to sort of plug into some of the issues and to connect with people who are doing feminist work locally. So, okay. So Gay Back in the Day, an intergenerational roundtable, came about because Charlene Tung, who's normally the chair of the department, and I were having a conversation about institutional memory and how quickly institutional memory disappears. We are a very young department in terms of our current faculty, and we have an associate professor and 2 assistant professors, which means that we all got here not very long ago. And yet the department itself has been around in some form since the early 1970s. And the only way to retain and preserve and rework and transform those legacies of the past is to continue to retell those stories and to pass those stories down in ways that don't just capture what it was like for people in the past, but also to make those experiences and that knowledge relevant to us today, so that we can use it to transform our lives and hopefully create aspirational visions that we can meet for the future. So we wanted to put this together, and we've been talking about it for a while, because we really believe in the power of dialogue and of the intimacy that can be provided when you listen and speak across and through differences, including generational ones. It's so important to have the humility to stand within diverse and dynamic communities and to find the courage to find possibility in every conversation and really have an eagerness to seek out all the varied wisdoms that they might contain. And so that's really what Gay Back in the Day is about. We're hoping that this will be a dynamic dialogue about what it was like to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender on campus in the first 3 decades of its existence, and then how that relates to people's lives here today. We're joined, and I'll just kind of go down the row here, by longtime Sonoma State staff member Chuck Rhodes, a member of our community here since 1980, former advisor to Byglass, which then became the QSA, and a father and grandfather. He's currently our Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs and Enrollment Management. Also, we have Ann Neal with us today, who was the founding Sonoma State Women's Studies Coordinator from, I think I have this right, 1972 to 75? Is that right? Okay. Ann developed the Woman Identified Woman course that, as the first course description for it read, quote, help liberated women and lesbians survive in a world that is hostile to them. Neal then went on to a long career as a professor of women's studies and comparative sociology, specializing in the areas of historical sociology of gender, race, and class inequality, as well as in feminist studies. Then there's me. I'm kind of the newbie on this panel in a way. I first came to campus in 2005 as an invited guest of what was then the Queer Studies Lecture Series put on by Nan Boyd. And then I didn't know that I'd become an instructor in the department soon thereafter. And then last fall I joined the department as its first full-time male faculty member. And now I'm the one to organize the series that I got invited to a few years ago. So, in 1999, Lena McCade graduated from Sonoma State in Women's and Gender Studies and also as a Hutchins double major. In 2008, she earned her PhD in American Studies from the University of New Mexico after spending a year as a dissertation fellow in the Feminist Studies department at UC Santa Barbara. So she's been a faculty member with me. We kind of came on the same class of fall 2008. And her research interests include reproductive politics, gender and race in US public health, feminist interdisciplinary methodologies, US-Mexico border studies, and feminist critical race and queer theories. So we encourage audience members to share their thoughts and observations and questions throughout the roundtable. And if you would be so kind to come up, I know it's intimidating and weird, to come up and speak into the microphone, that will allow it to be captured for the screencast, and hopefully we're going to put this up on Sonoma State's YouTube channel and all that fancy stuff. Yeah.
Institutional memory.
Yeah, institutional memory, damn it. If, for whatever reason, you don't feel comfortable coming up to the microphone and podium, but you still want to ask a question or have an observation or reflection, the beauty of this is you can do that from there, and the camera won't capture you, and the microphone won't capture you, and we can just reflect what you said back, so that we have this sort of double screen, if you want it, for yourself, but we can still kind of capture you in the dialogue for posterity. So what we're going to do, though, first of all, is just give each of them an opportunity to share their thoughts, and I thought we would go in sort of chronological order and start with Ann, and then go to Chuck.
Clearly the furthest back.
And then we'll ask some questions.
You're still younger than I am, so
yeah.
it's okay.
Sure I am.
And then we also have some questions that we're going to ask. Oh, one quick last thing. A special thanks to Stephanie Torres in Media Services, the library and Students for Social Change, as well as the WGS interns who really helped make this happen. Thank you all so much.
Well, did you want to try?
No, I wanted to.
No, I'm pretty fine.
Okay. First of all, I'm really glad to see all of you here, and that this thing is not only cooking along, but that you're having these kinds of events, because I totally agree with Don that keeping institutional memory, any memory alive is important, but there's so many stories that get lost because somebody didn't credit them or think that they were valuable. And I've been worrying about this my whole career, I guess. And I thought maybe a way to sort of jump into this, because I don't really know exactly where to start, is to just go back a little bit in my own autobiography in terms of what I was learning when I was in college, when I was your age. I was at Riverside, University of California, Riverside, from 1955 to 1959, and that's even much earlier than the 70s. But while I was there, that's when I was beginning to think that I wouldn't have called myself a lesbian. Probably the words were homosexual, and yet I didn't claim it because I was going out with guys that I liked very much too. It was sort of I was sort of moving back and forth, and I really did move back and forth a lot. And I thought, I got to grow out of this because see, I totally learned the Freudian analysis, which says it's an adolescent stage of development. So I thought when I went to graduate school, it would be all over. When I went to Berkeley, and I spent several years going back and forth. I'm not going to go into all the detail. If you're interested, I'll talk to you. But while I was at Riverside, I had a roommate that I convinced to go to the library and get the books on lesbians. Okay, I didn't say the word lesbian. And in those days, they kept them in secret stacks. They kept them where you could not get to them. And so here, these are some of the kinds of things I was reading. One is there's a whole bunch of Anne Aldrich novels. This is called Take a Lesbian to Lunch, but if you saw the cover, you get the idea. There are a couple of lipstick cigarettes in an ashtray, and they're all pretty much these stories. This one, called The Price of Salt, has this one woman with her hand on the shoulder of the other woman, and they're suffering, and the poor man is back here, and he's left out. And the deal is that I was this sort of very much, small town middle class person who was trying to figure out what was going on in the world. I got turned on to looking at race as an issue there at that school because I had a terrific professor, and he was telling us about Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad and all these things that nobody knew. I mean, realize it's 55 to, I probably took the class in 57. Martin Luther King's march had just happened, and the coming bus boycott in 55. So it was right in the center at that time. But students were not very political. Students like me were just beginning to open our little eyes just a tiny bit. The point I want to make here is in reading these, there wasn't anything to read except stuff like this, which is all about creepy, I felt like these creepy people that kind of go into bars and have to be very careful and say the password. And, it's like, I couldn't identify with it. I mean, it was just like, it scared me to death. I also read Kraft Ebbings' horrifying Psychopathy to Sexualis, which is, he interviews lesbians, but he got them out of prison. I mean, all of his lesbians, or anybody, they had been put in some kind of, that doesn't mean they're bad people, I'm not saying that, it's just that he picked his sample from a very unusual part and then told all the most bizarre stories he could think of, how lesbians do horrible things. I'm sorry to tell you this, but it was kind of like reading this blew my mind. They might get together and make love and pee on each other or something. I mean, this was just more than handle. So by the time the 70s came around, or the late 60s and then the 70s, and there began to be books like one of the first books that was a good book, that was just, I mean, it's like all these lights going, and it's so romantic. It's called Patience and Sarah. And I don't, have you read it?
Yeah.
Patience and Sarah by Isabel Miller. It was originally called We Too Must Love, which is unfortunately a name that's something like Take a Lesbian to Lunch, but this is much better. And it's based on a real story of this one artist and her partner, and it's got some beautiful things about what is gender and how is it to be a woman, and Patience teaches Sarah how to behave like a woman, like you always don't look at anybody in the eye, and you always, there's all these instructions about how to be submissive and etc. Anyway, it's a great book. We used to read it to each other. My partner and I used to read it to each other and laugh and cry, and it was like, oh my God, a book about somebody you could even identify with, you know. And so that meant a great deal to me. Then things started coming out like Ruby Free Jungle. Some of you may have heard of Rita Mae Brown's Ruby Free Jungle. That was a knockout. Except we made a critique of it in the sense that every story that she has in there of a love affair with a female always has problems. It really does. It's very interesting. And then Sappho Was Right on Woman came out. That was a really, really important, it's not fiction, it's a straightforward and talk about people's experience. This was interesting. Love Is for All, and it's by Maddie. You wouldn't know about this probably unless you were up in Seattle, which I went in 75 up to Puget Sound area. It was done in 74. But it's all about love and God and psychology and does listen, I can't see without my glasses. It's about the church, you know. Can homosexuals be stable parents? These questions were asked at the time, and they've been asked, and they're still being brought up by the right wing. There's another book. This is a terrible book. It's called Love Between Women, and by Charlotte Wolf, who is a psychiatrist, and we all thought, this is 72. There were a whole group of us who got involved in gay women's liberation in San Francisco, and Sally Gerhardt was part of that, and Kathy Cade and Liz Mahaney, and we decided the first thing we all wanted to do is do a critique of this book. I mean, read this book, because here's a book, Love Between Women, and it's horrible. And I keep everything, so I kept our analysis. We were going to publish it and everything, but we were in the early women's liberation where you couldn't put your name, it had to be everybody, and we just sort of So anyway, that's the kind of thing that affected me. The Lesbian Anthology, Amazon Expedition, there was Lesbian Nation. The literature started coming out, and it was the first time I read Women Identifying Women on mimeograph, and I have some mimeograph stuff here. I'm not going to show it all. I just keep it. I grabbed it, brought it here. But I just felt like I couldn't even hold the paper. It was so hot because it said, "Women, a lesbian is the rage of all women," something like that. It started off there, and it's like, whoa, you know. They said it. They said these words, you know. And it's not that I'm running around being enraged all the time. It was just like, you know, did you know another major women's liberation piece that came out of that era was the satire? It's really a satire, but it was also kind of true. The Scum Manifesto. You ever heard of it? You should know about it.
Yeah. It's
a wild and crazy piece, and you read it. It says men are responsible for everything. They created money, you know, things like that. Yeah, they made me laugh. You really dare say those things.
Society for cutting up men.
Yeah, the Society for Cutting Up Men. I mean, not that I didn't believe it at all, but I did think it was terribly funny.
Yeah, that's
right. Anyway, I went on, when I was here, I did teach, I taught one class. I was here for 1 year as a sociology replacement. I just finished my orals at Berkeley. I was at Berkeley in the right time to be in Berkeley, and I loved it. And I taught a class called, it's normally called Personality and Social Structure, and what did we call it? Something like Homosexuality and Identity, or something like that. And I taught it with 2 other students, and we had a huge batch of students make it, men and women, and it was really hairy. And out of that, then, because I was here and I was teaching social, J.J. Wilson asked me would I apply for being the first coordinator of women's studies, which I did do. Also, she had in this class, it's called, do you call it Changing Women now? Still, you don't. The main intro class in women's studies was called Changing Women, but before that it was called Pandora's Box. And they had panels every time, just different things, and my partner and I were on a panel about being a lesbian. One thing I wanted to say, and then I'll shut up, because I talk too much. I can't represent all what lesbians are like in that period. I can only really tell you what I experienced and what I saw or had something to do with or read about. Because there are so many ways to being a lesbian, and we couldn't even begin to reproduce it if we even had 5 people here trying to tell you what it was like, even at Sonoma State. Okay?
Great.
I mean, I'm going to stop there, okay?
Hi there. You kicked a few things for me. I thought I'd go back also and kind of talk about a little bit about my path, because I think my perception of what Sonoma State was like has to do with kind of who I was coming to Sonoma State. I'm from the South. I don't have the Southern accent anymore. I used to be in the mountains, and I was raised Baptist, not Southern Baptist. It was Black Muslim, and I was Southern Baptist. We're National Baptist. Make a note of that. Very conservative as well, but I went to college in the 60s. And I went to Virginia Tech, then an almost all-male school, and I started to venture out in 1973.
Right?
And in Madison, actually I was living in Madison, Wisconsin, but I wouldn't go out in Madison, Wisconsin. I went to Milwaukee, Chicago, Minneapolis, because even in Chicago, police still raided bars. And even the big cities, I can remember one of the bars in Chicago, a big dance bar, well, sort of dance bar. Beside the bar, they had 2 red lights. And the red lights started to flash. That meant that the police were spotted. And you couldn't be standing, it was a kind of a men's bar. You couldn't be near each other. You had to like, yeah, kind of thing. No dancing, no touching, and the mafia owned the bar, they paid off the cops, but they still got raided and so forth. And in Madison, where I lived, the police actually go to the parking lots near the bars at night to write down license plate numbers and write them. And so they would stop people and sometimes from your house to if there was a quote a gay crime. From the early 70s, I had children, got married, divorced, and came out within a 3-year period. Yeah. I came out professionally in 1976. And in the student services profession, today I'm the longest out person who's still practicing in the student affairs in the country that I know of. And it's a real challenging time at that time because I worked in housing and people in housing didn't come out. And because we were afraid that since we ran dormitories that we would somehow use our keys to molest the students. Yeah, right. But one thing to talk about when I was in graduate school, I did some of the same thing because the books were behind the desk in the reference room, and so. But fortunately, because I got smart, I was getting a degree in family development, and I decided to focus on human sexuality. So that became my cover to take out books that were taboo. And one of the books that we used in class was called Everything You Wanted to Know About Sex But Was Afraid to Ask. That was a hot book. But the chapter, it was really a good book, except the chapter on male homosexuality is wrong, wrong, wrong. And so when I read this book as a textbook, I'm thinking, that's not me. I'm not picking up men in bathrooms, I'm not chasing children, and I'm not wearing dresses and wanting to be a woman. And so I kept thinking, well, I'm having sex with men, but that too shall pass because I was a predominantly male school. I think as soon as I could find the right woman, which I thought I did and got married. It's like a long story there. But again, it was the stuff that was out there was so destructive. And the first place we studied about homosexuality was in my sociology class on deviant behavior. And not the regular textbook, so I mean, and I thought I was pretty smart. I came out in '76 and having been working on college campuses for a few years, I left there and moved to San Francisco in 1978 at the height of the gay migration. And have any of you seen the movie Milk? That really
Only 3, 4?
that really encompasses a lot part of what my experience was. Cleve Jones, who is in the movies, is still a personal friend of mine. I saw Harvey Milk a couple of times. I worked on the No 6 campaign, so that was part of my existence. And so my last job in San Francisco was with the mayor's office. And of course, in 79, when I started working in the mayor's office, I mean, they picked one of everything. So being an out black male was like a plus, you know, they got a double bonus. Well, it did. And then, because I worked in higher education, I came back to Sonoma State. And Sonoma's way different. And Santa Rosa was about 85,000 people. Roller Park was 20. Cotati was about 1,500. And I thought I won't be here for 2 years, and I'm getting the hell out of here. because it was still very much a rural county and very suburban. Although when I came here, there were 3 bars. There was a gay bar in Roanoke Park, a men's bar mostly, called the Pit Stop or Crank Chapter various times, the Santa Rosa Inn. And there's a lesbian bar on Stony Point Road. And so none of which exists now. But when I came to the campus, what surprised me was that there was, I'm thinking Bay Area pretty liberal. And when I came to Sonoma State, what I discovered was, for those who worked here, that even those who were identified, I identify as gay men, played under the radar. And there were a number of married men who I would see from time to time at the gay bars or other places. But as I was thinking back, I can remember only 2 openly gay people 3 thinking back, on campus. Sue Berg, who was in the nursing faculty, and she went to the JC. Arthur Hill, who was in music, and who's retired here. And Ron Logston, who became a friend of mine, who was the Ron Logston basketball, and he was at the Career Center. And I was kind of, and even the people I knew, the late Jeff Doubt, who became the Dean of Social Sciences, the first Dean of the School of Business, even though his partner was working here, it was like this open secret of who was, but no one really talked about who was and who wasn't. And even some of the people who were identified would take an opposite sex person to a campus function. And so this was very different from my San Francisco, where I'm like, you know, big old out person. And I come here, so I spent a lot of time going to San Francisco, even though my children lived with me when I first moved here. And so I was a single dad, and so like every second or third weekend, I'd hire a babysitter and go to the city for the weekend, so I could have some sanity. I did teach, I think I was the first male who taught me women's studies. I taught a class called Men's Lives for about 2 or 3 semesters when Kate Trimberger was the coordinator. But my other jobs and other responsibilities. But I didn't really come out fully at work until the late 80s. I mean, everybody knew it. You know, and I was advising Byglass, which had several different names for those periods. I was nominated for Advisor of the Year, so clearly everybody kind of suspected that I was. And some people were confused because A, I was black and I was gay, and I was a dad. And, you know, and so I got confused. So the environment here was very different here because even though, and by the same time that I arrived, the Russian River came alive as a gay place. It really came alive. And so our students in the Byglass in those days was more, well, tend to be more men than women in those days. I know that's not true now. But a lot of the guys would go, and the students were older. The average age of the residents I was working with was older and so forth. So a lot of the students would go out. But the campus tended to be politically correct about being inclusive, but practically very closed. I mean, it didn't embrace people. I mean, they talked in conversation about embracing, you know, people who are gay, but it was really kind of, just don't talk too much about it. One of the questions about down here, in terms of institutional memory, from what I know, was that Sonoma State was one of the first schools to have a 2-year bachelor's program in nursing. And in the old days, many women got their RN degree by hospital-affiliated schools of nursing. You didn't go to university. And so as the profession changed, Sonoma State created this 2-year BS program, or BA program in nursing. And when I came in 1980, it may have been revised, but the gay student group, Jan Hitchcock, who was in the School of Nursing, and who was heterosexually identified, and did all her work in lesbian healthcare, she and Sue Berg were the main people behind keeping the gay student group active because there were a number of gays and lesbians who were in the nursing program. So when I first came here, most of the students who were put in that QSA were nursing students who, because their faculty members realized that they needed to have an opportunity to out. And so part of the history that goes back, I understand from Jeff Dowd, who's since passed away, that there were some other movements in the 70s and so forth, but they didn't sustain themselves. And so QSA and its predecessors have been going on now since at least the late 70s, but it's an offshoot of the School of Nursing. And Jan still, if she still says that she goes to lifelong learning, if you want to bring Jan in sometime, she can really tell you some stories. But she got her doctorate in lesbian healthcare. When it was one of those things that was still not, everybody kept assuming that Jan was lesbian because she was studying with association. But yeah, so when I came here, it was a really different environment. And so much of my life was going out to the city. And I'll stop there.
Great. Do you want to kick off and asking the question?
Sure. I guess I'm really interested in the question that Dawn created, which is, what were the most exciting parts of being gay or lesbian on campus back in the 1970s or the 1980s?
For me, I'm not sure there's many exciting parts.
Yeah.
In all honesty, I think when I was advisor for the student group, I used to live in Roanoke Park over the C-section, and I would have parties, and big parties. And we would have, between the JC and Sonoma State, we'd have 50 or more people in my house for parties. And so I think kind of creating spaces at that particular time for me was exciting, because I'm still in contact with some of those young people who are now not young anymore, but they're close to, if they're not in their 50s now. But so I think part of that was, but I think the campus was very, we didn't really talk about much over here. So I think for me, the excitement of happening in places like going to Granville or going to Gay Pride in San Francisco, or some other things, but it was kind of like a neutral zone for me about my association of being gay on campus. But as I said, for many years it was kind of like very under the radar. One of the things that Sue Burke used to talk about was when she was here and she left that reason, there were, I don't think I'm outing anybody, but I don't care because they're retired. Almost, at that time, if you were a PE instructor, you were also a coach. Those two were intertwined. And almost all of the women, I would say all of them, I think pretty close to all the women who were in the department were lesbian. And Sue would be on committees with some of the women, and she would report that outside of if she walked across campus and she spoke to any of those women, they wouldn't even acknowledge her existence in public. That's really across campus. And so there was such a closetedness, particularly for the women on campus.
No, it's in the PE department.
Right.
I mean, big time.
Right, but not just for the PE. There were other women too, but it was just such a.
Yeah.
And so when I came into the campus, I learned very quickly that this was a culture here.
Yeah.
Well, my experience is really the opposite.
Okay.
Because when we started the Women's Studies program, I mean, not only, it's hard to separate out what was going on in gay liberation. Now, and that's another thing. It was called gay liberation. And one of the things that happened is there was a split, and because women's liberation was happening too. And so we had gay women's liberation, you see. And it was something like the literature that I was telling you that started to come out. And I have little pieces of 70, 72, 73, and the kind of things people were writing. And it actually was thrilling. It was just, things were bubbling and popping and people were together. And it's partly because we had the Women's Studies program, and it was somewhat we didn't care what they thought. Yes, it's true. And I know that, for example, of people who were in PE and stuff, they have to be very careful because everybody assumed they were lesbians and going through the whole trip. But it's like, we had our own world, sort of, and it's somewhat in a way. And, I was, like, I'm an academic, but at the time, I thought I was so naive. I was just in my early 30s. I mean, I shouldn't be so naive. But I thought, if I'm any good, I'll have tenure, right? I mean, why have tenure? It's stupid. You may not know what tenure is. It's sort of like you go on probation for about the first 6 years, and then you're an assistant professor all that time, And then you go up for tenure, and then you might become an associate professor, and that means you get to stay, sort of, unless they catch you doing some awful thing and they want to get rid of you. You know, or they get rid of the department. I mean, there are a lot of ways they get rid of people. And then you become a full professor. That's like when you've made Eagle Scout or something. And I finally made full professor. I went to the University of Sound after a year. But at the time I was here, I didn't have my doctorate. I was so excited about what was going on in women's studies because, like, there hadn't been any women's studies. There wasn't anything like that. I could go on about that at great length, but women's studies and the whole thing about coming out publicly as a lesbian and speaking and being on a panel and doing all that, because like being on that panel, that was the first panel I was ever on, and it was scary. And I was on with my partner, and everybody asked you like things like, well, what do you lesbians eat? That's a joke. No, but there's just so many things that you're kind of putting yourself out to be exposed in a way. And I didn't have the experience that Chuck's talking about until I went up to University of Puget Sound. And they didn't have a boring kind of a women's studies program up there. They had a little bit of one, and I was going up there to be hired. And I came back from the interview and said, I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there. They're all 15 and they're pink and, you know, you know. But I ended up going there, and I had a really good teaching experience there for 26 years. The job I had here was not a tenure track. It was 11/12's position. And what that means is you have no benefits whatsoever, and also the dean at that time, and I probably won't mention the names if I should, she's a lesbian, I know, but she was very snooty about that we shouldn't have this women's studies program, and that J.J. Wilson had the ultimate academic integrity, and it's because of her that we had a program. And I said, are you talking about me? And she said, no, and you're not a member of this academy. And so, I mean, it was really snotty. And so I started looking for a, quote, real job right away. And unfortunately, the great thing was, I got to stay on the topic of the lesbian issue, but the student issue was so important because we had student taught classes. And I would work with all the students who would then apply. We set it up so they would apply to do a class, and then we would meet once a week, and I would work with them like we call it teaching and planning. And they were so hot because they were reading everything, and part of my job was just to keep them under control. Because they would do things like I was called into the dean. They're doing self-exams. And I said, oh, come on, you guys, put a piece of paper over the window. Do it off campus, you know, but I mean, people it was like menstrual
extraction
rituals, going out in the garden at midnight. There were lots of things, and all different kinds of things. Some students wanted to put something in the water so men would become, you know, impotent and stuff, and they told them, this is perfect. They didn't have anything to put in the water. I mean, they were spinning out crazy ideas. But on the other hand, there were all these women starting groups, and I, right now, am on, I'm just going to throw all this stuff together. It's like a collage, okay? It wasn't just in the women's studies program at all. Within the community of Sonoma County, people started moving here. Tons of women, even from, like some woman just told us that she and her partner drove here from Connecticut, and they got here and they found this place called Covitai and saw the Sevastopol, and their car broke down and they stayed. Sebastopol Cotai. But I mean, it was a great and wondrous time. And there was a bar. See, the bar thing, if you don't, why would there be bars? Because that's the only place you could go and actually eat, except in women's studies. And there were women's coffee houses and a place called Carla's, and just the women, especially a lot of the students, there were people who were just in the community, started forming all this stuff. I'm on this group that just started this thing 2 years ago called Lesbian Archives of Sonoma County, because we found out that there's all this stuff that isn't being kept. And we have found out that we can identify at least 64 organizations that were formed either by lesbians or lesbian supported. Some of them were food cooperatives, some of them were theater groups, some of them were like the Brown Bag Women's Readers Theater. They didn't all happen in '72. It's kind of like the Women's Studies program was a hotbed of energy. And also, I can't say it's just the Women's Studies program at all, because the women's movement was so vibrant and so, I don't know, like little seeds popping up all over, you know, 1,000 flowers bloom or something like that. There were women mechanics, there were people doing reading groups, there were, before that there were rap groups. People had what they call rap groups. You just have a group and talk, and that was very, very neat. But I just want to tell you this one thing. In '72, a bunch of us from Sonoma State and Santa Rosa JC, maybe it was before I got the coordinator's job, it doesn't matter because it's really connected. They were going to put on the play, The Killing of Sister George at Santa Rosa JC. I had taught there before, so I felt very okay about saying, this is no good, you can't do this. We joined men's and women's groups. We were pretty smart, I think, because there was a gay student union, and I have here their earliest thing, and mimeograph, you guys probably never see mimeograph. But anyway, even because list who's there and the phone numbers and everything, and some of the guys were, they wrote these wonderful things. Do you remember Jack Richards? Because he came from Eugene, and he'd been in a men's group there, and he wrote some wonderful stuff. But anyway, we had the men's group and the women's group, and then the Gay Community Coalition. And I had this very good gay man friend named David. And David used to be so upset because the women wanted to meet separately. Because he says, that's who I talk to. I tell things to the women. We said, David, you've got to talk to the men. The men have to learn how to talk to each other. They always turn to women about their feelings, you know? So that you had those gender issues within the male-female thing. And we also discovered that some gay men don't like women at all. And that shouldn't be too surprising, but you know, just like some lesbians don't like men at all. But a lot of gay and lesbians come together, and we really did in that. We held a huge, we challenged the dean of Dean Hauser and the head of the play, who happens to be gay. I mean, the head of the department who was choosing to put this play on. And if you look closely at this play, it also was a movie. It's a satire, and it's pretty demeaning. And we gave this whole analysis of, look, if you didn't know any lesbians in the whole world, which most people thought they didn't, right? The average person going to this play is going to think at least 90% of them, or 80% are going to think they don't know any lesbians or gay people. When they see this movie, they're going to think that's what lesbians are really like. It's like if you use Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and I just saw that movie again on Netflix. It is so horrible. Their fight is so horrible. It's Elizabeth Taylor and Robert Burton, and he's a college professor, and she's the daughter of the college president. And they are just cutting each other to ribbons. They're both drinking their brains out. They're just, cutting each other up. And our argument was, if you showed that, and they gave this play 13 times, by the way, if you showed that to a bunch of people who've never known what straight people were like, that's what they think straight people were like. And it's just as bad. And so they, I must say, in this largely Brookhauser, but in their, something positive about them, I can't think of the right word right now, they agreed to give us $1,000 each to have a full day on homosexuality. I have the program from
Wow.
this. We did a teach-in, we did panels, we had films, we had poetry, we did all that, and we had things for men and things for women, and some together. And that was 1972 in April, and I had the Press Democrat did a whole thing on it, and they put the words in the Press Democrat, lesbians protest play. I bet it's the first time they ever put lesbian in the newspaper.
No, I think it is. I think that.
And that would have been terrifying for people to say lesbians in the newspaper.
Yeah. Yeah, Emily Roy, who's a master's student here, actually, is doing a wonderful thesis on on lesbian community in Sonoma County, but also the centrality of lesbian participation to the women's movement in Sonoma County, and how important Sonoma County was nationally and regionally in terms of the women's movement. And she does, I think, mention in there that that was the first time the word lesbian was used in the Press Democrat. There it is. It's
If you want to
amazing.
come look at any of these artifacts,
Archival things are so great, yeah. Yeah. I guess, Chuck, actually I have a question for you. When, if at all, did the issue of HIV and AIDS start to become visible or present on this campus? And do you feel like there was a period in which it was more visible, and do you think that there's been a decline in visibility since then? Yes.
That's a really emotional issue. Having lived in San Francisco during the time that I did, I started to tear up, it's okay, folks. I moved up here in August of 1980. And soon thereafter, people started to become sick, and in those days, died quickly. And looking back, there were people who I knew who were one of the earliest getting sick, but we hadn't even identified what it was that getting sick. Because I worked at Church Street Station, which is the biggest, best-known gay restaurant in the world at the time. And so when I moved to Sonoma County and started going to the river, friends, people I worked with and associated with, because there's a real close tie between Guerneville and San Francisco. The river was San Francisco's playground. And so people started getting sick at the Woods, which is the original Woods where I worked, pretty quick in about the mid-80s. And so most people, when they got sick with HIV, when they became aware that they died within less than 2 years, sometimes even quicker. I was part of Bay Area Gay Fathers, and Steve Gomes, who was a social worker, an out social worker in Sonoma County. Steve died within weeks of his diagnosis. And so we formed a AIDS committee, ad hoc committee here on campus of faculty, staff, and students, and started doing HIV education very early in the epidemic. And went into a variety of classes. And in the residence halls, we did programs. And in the early days, there was so much misinformation. And there was such a, I can remember being in classes and having done, when I was in Wisconsin, because my sex education, I used to do contraceptive education. So for me, talking about condoms and all kinds of things just came real natural. But I can remember being in many a class, and 2/3 of the way through it, one or more students would go to the place of it being a moral or God's punishment. I'm also very religious and have a very strong spirituality, so I'm very secure in my faith, so we have conversations. But oftentimes those students would shut down, so you couldn't engage in it. So we did all kinds of things on campus. We put condom machines in the residence halls and places. We did all kinds of things, doing the best that we could to educate students. I created an AIDS memorial that happened every year on campus that happened for 5 or 6 years. Cleve Jones actually came up here twice to speak for that. He charged like $100. It's a favor to me. If you don't know who Cleve Jones is from the movie, he's the person who founded the AIDS quilt. So he's like big time name, you know. But we had other people who came up and did presentations, and it was so amazing that every time we would do the memorial, afterwards someone would come to me and say, you know, thank you for doing it. My son is sick, my son has died, my brother or somebody. And I couldn't come, not because it was too emotional. I couldn't let people know that this is in my family. I remember a woman who worked in the cafeteria, who worked in the commons, and she came, and she just loved me after that. And every time I go to, every time I go into the commons, she'd always sneak me snickerdoodles. Because she was so appreciative of the fact that we were remembering.
Yeah.
And then we lost several students. The student who first greeted me when I arrived on campus in 1980, Jorge, died. Jeff Down, the dean of business, and the first dean of business economics, became sick, and we became a part of his care team. Another young man who was over in the financial aid office died. A faculty member in Spanish, I remember, died, and so it hit the campus, and so it was hard. It was really, really hard because we were trying to educate, and many of the heterosexual students kept thinking that it wasn't about them, and we brought a young lady from Santa Rosa to speak for one of the things who was HIV positive and died in the short term after AIDS. We brought on the anonymous testing, and the person who worked with the health department, who was on our community, died. And it became so pervasive. And it was also the sense of powerlessness with it, because it was such a quick disease. I mean, I remember, I won't name the person, but a member of the pretty high level administrator, husband died, and she didn't want to share publicly that he was sick. And so it hit the campus in waves. One was trying to do education, but for most of the people who died in the earliest rounds, whether on or off campus, they had become infected before they even knew that the virus existed or how it was transmitted. And so it was hard to be in classes and saying this is God's punishment, and this is sin, and people deserve what they get for being homosexual and but there were a number of students who said that, and others. And I think the campus, and I won't go to politics like that, but we stopped paying as close attention to the HIV epidemic, and it just kind of moved into the woodwork, and people still get infected and still die, although, people now, I think I read someplace that if detected early, the longevity is now 20-some years. And so I think young people think, well, at the end of 20 years, there'll be a cure, and of course, the longevity now may go to 30 or longer, because we only have so many years behind it. But we did fundraisers to help. One of my closest friends who died early founded the food bank out in Grenville. And so at times we raised food for the food bank for people with HIV. We brought pounds in of people who are HIV positive back in those days. And one of the things that you may not be aware of is that in the earliest, probably the first 10 years, KS, which is a type of cancer, was a part of AIDS, which is no longer relevant. So people who had the lesions, if you were white blonde, as my friend John Manley was, he was almost totally black when he died because he was covered with lesions. And you don't see that anymore. But you bring someone in to do a panel that's sitting there who has a wasting syndrome, and whose hair's falling out, and whose body is covered. We weren't trying to shock people, but we're trying to say that this is not anything to play with, use protection, and the early days was, well, know your partners, and that will help you, well, how does knowing your partner, if you know your partner and you limit the number of partners, then you would reduce the risk of like, we did a lot of misinformation in the early days, because we didn't have we had to learn into that, but yeah, it was the campus tried to respond, but I think we have not. We just, we do like one more AIDS day, we throw out a few condoms, and that's kind of the extent of what we do now. Yeah. But there was a real aggressive program for about 7 or 8 years here.
Oh. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Ask another question.
Okay. This is sort of a future-looking question, which is what hopes do you have for LGBT academics or social life or activism at SSU, either for the future or in the present moment? What types of hopes do you have, what you can see happen here on campus?
I have a couple. In the past 5 to 6 years, we have seen the emergence of trans students on campus, and they have been particularly active in QSA. We have a trans student who's a resident assistant in the residence hall. And they've been in leadership roles, etc. Not just the trans students, but I think, so I also supervise the student leadership program. And throughout the campus, we have openly gay, lesbian, and trans, bisexual students and queer students who are in CSA positions and some orientation positions and peer mentors for classes. And so for me, the fact that and Julie Greathouse, who's the advisor to QSA and who works for me, and I have openly gay and lesbian staff members. My department in housing at that time, we were I think number 1 or number 2 in the country to openly recruit gay and lesbian professionals. So they've been staff members, although there were people out there before, they didn't openly recruit them. And so we've kind of created an environment. So I think now we are getting more comfortable. I can remember probably 20 years ago when a person applied for a student activities position as an open lesbian, and we wouldn't say why she wasn't hired, but even the students supported her, but we didn't hire her because we didn't want to do that. And I look now and I see throughout the campus that there are more and more openly gays and lesbians and trans and queer people who are on campus. And so I think in those situations, the future says that we are becoming much more open to being inclusive at all levels. I mean, I know one open lesbian dean, and I'm an assistant VP, and I can remember time. I know the dean that you were talking about, but people who were just didn't, even though the president even knew it, we didn't ever want to be open about it. So I think that in the future we're seeing more and more people who are, one day we may have an openly gay, lesbian, queer, trans president of the university, and that's happening nationwide more and more. So I think that's a part of the future I see. I watch us go from being very closeted with people to now having people in a variety of positions, and not just in queer studies or whatever, but other places. We march in the San Francisco Gay Freedom Day Parade, and that's funded by administration and finance. And heterosexual people fund us to march, and the group continues growing every year. So when people see us on the streets of San Francisco in the Gay Lesbian Freedom Marching Day Parade, the time is longer and longer every year. Just the parade. They also invite students to want to consider Sonoma State, not just always consider places like Berkeley and San Francisco State. But that's a couple of places. And I think that in the next few years, I watched the evolution of domestic partner benefits. First domestic partner benefits, and then domestic partnership, and the back and forth on marriage. And I think that once that comes to be finally stabilized for real, I think that will have a different impact on more and more of our students being comfortable coming out. One of the things I'm particularly proud about our campus is our, which is unusual, our student religious groups have never come out in very homophobic ways in the 30 years I've been here. And you don't see that a lot of campuses. Oftentimes, every time there's an issue that's happened nationally, the equivalent of the campus student religious groups, whether they, regardless of the orientation of the religious affinity, there'll be letters in the school newspaper, whatever going against us. We just don't have that here. We haven't had that here of this. There are homophobic folks here and homophobic acts, but to have this organized kind of thing in the newspaper. That's, you know, I go to some campuses I visit, and you pick up almost every week, and there's, look at any campus, and there's this kind of pro and con on gay issues. I was like, you know, get a grip. You know, go study. But they just hadn't happened. So I think part of the future is that, you know, we actually had I'm going to put this on tape, a little bastard that run at Metro Cotard High School. Who was very years ago, well, I wanted to take a stick and beat the shit out of him. And not feel free. Who decided to make his mark by wanting to kind of come out against gay students, and he actually came on campus with a wagon and so forth.
Was he the one with the truck?
Yeah.
And they drove all over the place, these signs, homosexuals are evil.
Right,
blah,
but he was
blah,
the future Newt Gingrich. And our students here rallied against him.
Oh, that's great.
They really did, and they made, and so they said, well, you don't have a permit, and they did all this stuff, and I can't remember the little boy's name, but he should have been whipped as a child. Sometimes competing is good, okay? And not just recreationally. But I was surprised, our students came, so I think the future, what to me is optimistic, is our students, even those who don't support gays and lesbians and trans and queer students, tend not to be actively organized against the students here. And that's really unusual. I have friends of mine who work at schools with 40 and 50,000 students. And there's always a fairly good contingent who makes it their business to always being after the queer folks.
Oh yeah, always. I mean, at Berkeley, even they were there when I was in graduate school in the 2000s.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I will say that in my classes, I've had evangelical Christian students who were in my queer studies classes,
Right.
who were clearly felt that many of the things that I was talking about were absolutely antithetical to something that was at the core of their being. And they did their homework, and they talked, and they involved themselves in the classes, and I was duly impressed. And totally, for me, like, I was like, I need to rethink my own biases about people who, you know, might come with these really predisposed moral kinds of beliefs about my very livelihood, and yet are willing to grapple with the questions as I pose them and the subject matter as I pose them. And I thought that was, I found that very impressive here, actually. Yeah. Did you want to answer the same question about vision and possibility?
Yeah, I won't say as much. I can't say so much about the campus because I haven't been here. But one of the things that bounce off of your saying, Joe, is the idea of openness doesn't mean that we're going to recruit. But the other piece is the whole, it really more than what could happen on campus, I'm thinking this whole shift in the question of what's happening with gay marriage, I think is extremely important in two things. Having people actually stop running and screaming into the corners and actually look at what this could really mean. Think about people they know in their families. What does this mean to them? And then stick up for those people in their families. They're doing it. And I think in large part, there's still people who are terrified and all upset. And usually that's because they're afraid of their own feelings. Usually that's the case. It has something to do with that. But I really do believe, I get sometimes nervous that there's going to be, you know, you can't predict what the power shift is going to be, and whether or not those who made it their business to fight gay marriage to the death will win or not. But it's pretty amazing that there are now about 5 states, and countries like Spain, gay marriage is legal in Spain. I mean, that's not something we would predict in our prejudices about what we think about other countries. Our country is the one that's having all the trouble. Canada's okay, you know, and I think that's going to make a difference with families and with students and with everybody. But I think the main thing is that students, the thing I like to see is students exploring who they really are while they can do it.
I think one of the things I was at too is I think we've had a couple of issues on campus in the past few weeks, few years. And one's the Ron Marston tournament, and the other one is the Army recruiting and so forth. The recruitment, the Army and military recruitment camp. And I have been impressed that our QSA students have taken a much more mature dialogue than some of my academic faculty members who want to shove things down their throat. And so I think because I think our students, what's exciting is that students recognize that this is not simply a black and white issue.
Right.
And that I watched them engage them in the dialogue to say, you know, there's pros and cons, and you just can't simply say, you know, and are there other ways to address injustices rather than simply banning everybody, you know, because when you've been on the side that's been banned, you know, it's easy to want to jump to the side and you feel like you can do the banning rather than engaging in dialogue. And I've been impressed with our students more than some of our members of our campus. Faculty.
I was just wondering if you wanted to.
That's what I was thinking. Why don't we open it up then as a dialogue to the audience? Any questions or comments?
About anything.
About anything?
Just ask me what I do in bed, okay?
Yeah. Do you want to come up to the mic, or would you rather just sit there? Excellent. Thank you so much.
You get extra credit.
I was wondering if any of you guys have actually been part of a hate crime. But you kind of answered how this campus doesn't really have like the opposition against it. But I was actually kind of worried coming here because I'm a freshman and my high school had very big problems. We had hate crimes all the time on both sides. Whenever a student would come out, them and their family could be assaulted, but the gay community around there would also kind of go after the gang leaders that did that. So I was wondering if you guys had any kind of personal experience with that.
Well, I haven't. I've had a couple of really bad experiences with individuals that I trusted and turned out I couldn't. But I have not had that kind of experience, and I'm really aware of a couple of years ago I went to a white privilege conference. That was one of the speakers was Kevin Phillips. Is that his name? He wrote this wonderful book called an autobiographical book called Mama's Boy, Preacher's Son. And he started an organization called Gay and Lesbian Allies. No, it's GLAD or something like that.
Listen, the Teachers and Educators Network, that one?
It's about, they're doing all this work with high schools that are having this problem.
Yeah.
And, or Glean or something.
Right, now it's called
Gay, but now it's called that.
Listen.
Listen,
Yeah.
that's it. Listen, you know, I mean, it's shocking. But it's about allies, and it's about the possibility, it's like P-flag, you know, the parents of lesbians, gays, etc. People having the guts, straight people not running and hiding and really being able to do something. Now, I don't know if in your high school, did they try to get any help?
They tried to. We had stuff. We even had like town hall meetings because there were a couple other high schools that had problems. But I know that mine was kind of the center of it, and it was really just kind of terrifying. And I wasn't even really involved in it. I knew some of my friends were gay, and I remember when one of them did come out, he was very scared, especially because his mom had just had a baby, and so they were really terrified for just his family in general, and I just can't imagine being actually in the center of that. So.
For me, I try to think back, because I think the answer would be yes and no. I think in the early days there was a number of situations which probably non-violent hate crimes. I remember when I came out to my supervisor in 1976, we had probably a 3-hour conversation, and he kept telling me what he was comfortable with me doing about my outlets. And I kept countering that to the single heterosexual people. I was at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And finally, at the end of like this 3-hour conversation, he went, okay, if something comes up, we'll talk about it. But because he wanted to put preconditions, but then his supervisor his supervisor was having a real hard time with it, because Newell is like, in the housing profession, like, he's like my God. But within about 8 months, I was the leader of the gay men's community within Madison. And this is when they were trying to recall the gay ordinance, gay rights ordinance, and we were the first place that ever successfully, because we actually had to withdraw. But I was on the television and the radio all the time, and in the newspaper. And sometimes they'd come to my work and interview me, and he just kind of rolled with it. But during that time, I had people who would call names. And I think sometimes when I was doing the AIDS education and so forth, I didn't take it personally. So I have not been the victim of violent hate crimes. Have I not got a job because of my gayness? Probably. Have I been discriminated against racially in San Francisco? Hell yes. And that was probably the biggest shock for me coming to California from Wisconsin, which was pretty progressive, and coming to San Francisco and finding the amount of racism and sexism in the gay men's community in the 70s. I was blown away by that. It was a whole different conversation. And actually, are there people who have probably pulled away? Are there parents at times who have felt uncomfortable with me? Yeah, but you know, I can honestly say I've never bothered one of their children. So and there are times that people have been suspicious, you know, not trusting. And I think for me, and I say this selectively, the older I become, the more brazen I become. I don't take much shit from anybody. And most people know if you don't take no shit, they won't mess with you. And most of the time, I've experienced is when people feel like they can take advantage of you emotionally, psychologically, or whatever. They'll try it, you know. But you know, it's like, you know, if you want to muck with me, come on. I may lose, but we're gonna both go down hard. You know. And when I worked in Guerneville, and I spent 8 years working at the river as a second job, there were occasionally, sometimes, somebody would holler at me, and usually not toward me, they were toward other people, because I was pretty well known in Guerneville. They knew not to mess with me, you know, 'cause I'm crazy, you know. But yeah, so the answer is non-violently, no. Other ways, I think, probably definitely yes, you know. But, you know, I'm totally out with my family, my children, my grandchildren, everybody knows I'm gay, you know, it's not, you know, we've got to work at it, but it's a part of who I am, so, you know. But also, I do know it happens to the students here are victims of self-bullying.
Do you think that those kinds of things happen with students more when they didn't know each other? Was it people sort of organizing their action against other whole groups?
Not that I know of. Like, we had a gay straight alliance.
Oh, you did?
But they weren't the ones that were going after, like, the people that came after each other, that did the hate crimes. It was just like,
somebody else.
yeah, it was mainly the gangbangers that did the hate crimes. There was a lot of Hispanic gangs around where I lived, and they just, once they found out somebody was gay, they would just threaten them and would go, they'd break into houses, take stuff, and if that one person got mad, if the person that had come out got mad enough, they would gather their friends and go after them. So it was just very scary situation.
I think part two, since I've been in charge of the program here, we make it very clear that we have a zero tolerance. And I think schools oftentimes are so afraid to put their foot down, because they're so afraid of oftentimes, and this is stereotypical, of the religious right coming after them, that they allow too much to happen. You know, come after me, you know, because I'm saying, you know, no, I will not allow you to come here and abuse another person that I'm responsible for. You can have an intellectual conversation. When you start messing, you got to answer to me, and that's when I abandon the thought of freedom of speech. I tell the parents during orientation, you know, you can express your, but if you start calling names and doing things like that, this child will be sent out the dormitory, so probably be sent home. You know, end of story. You know. And so, but I do hear that in many public schools, teachers are afraid of being parents, are afraid of parents. You know, and I've been doing this for almost 40 years. Ain't nobody I'm afraid of.
Well, it does seem like there's a within high schools in particular, one of the things that's been interesting, I think, depressing/interesting in the last 20 or 30 years is that there's been a greater public dialogue about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer issues. I mean, you all know the whole "that's so gay" phrase, but I mean, even just as somebody who was not openly gay, but was in high school in the 80s, I was very, in a certain way, I was fortunate that people weren't really looking to figure out who was gay and who was not in the 80s in a certain way. Like if you weren't, I was relatively gender normative in my presentation, right? And so even though I was quit wrestling to be in the spring musical, right? Gay, but I think that there's a lot more policing. There's a lot more acceptance now in high schools, but I think there's also a lot more policing to try to ferret out those people who are trans or gay or queer in some way or another, or lesbian in some way or another.
Do you think any of that has to do with how much more now the whole lesbian gay issue is in the media, so that people are alert to it and want to see who is and who isn't?
Yeah, but I think one of the things also happens, and this has been tested out, there's some research, that the majority of school boards tend to be white and very traditional and very conservative. And there have been school boards which have banned all student clubs rather than recognize a QSA. And so it tends to be that the school boards in most local communities, again, I'm not saying anything against race or religious, they tend to be very fundamental. And so if you look who's running in your local communities for school boards, I'm amazed at some of the school districts will be 75–80% students of color, and the school board's all white. You know, who tend to be upper income, etc. And there may, not always will, but maybe a disconnect. And then most people who run for school boards identify as heterosexual. You know, you see them on television, they ask their wives and kids, hi, you know, see, I'm heterosexual, you know. That's a presentation, you know.
I mean, this sounds bizarre, the association that you gave me, but I just showed my class some of the early films on Eyes on the Prize.
Right.
And the two men who killed Emmett Till, at the end of this was a murder of a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who said hi baby to a woman in a little grocery store. And so her husband and his brother or something came and got him in the night, took him out of the house, beat him up, killed him, smashed him, threw him in the river, tied him to something. It was a horrible, horrible case, 1955, okay? Afterwards, they are let off by an all-white jury. And the first thing they do is start kissing their wives.
Right.
I mean, they just kiss their wives and they're all so happy. I mean, it's like to prove that they're like regular, and it wasn't even about gayness.
Right.
But it just shows how that's supposed to validate them. It's okay with that.
I maybe want to say one more thing about the hate crime, and then maybe if you want to take another question. So I have experienced a hate crime. I never prosecuted it, but I was shot with a paintball gun while walking with my partner. And so they definitely called us names, so it was targeted for those reasons. But I also want to say, and there are other instances, but that's one that definitely stands out. It stained my dress. Which is the least of I thought I was really shot. Luckily it was yellow paint and not red. But yeah, I mean, definitely a terrifying experience. But I think that what's happened to me as a result of having experiences like that is that it's really made me think deeply about violence and about the purpose of violence, right? Is oftentimes to silence people. And while I'm torn about the hate crime issue, because while I really do feel like for people that do commit these acts based on somebody's identity, there has to be a type of retribution that recognizes that. At the same time, I'm really concerned about incarcerating people in a system that I know is also a racist and classist and sexist system. So I struggle with that as a queer community about thinking of alternatives to forms of violence so that people who do experience violence can get a type of justice that then doesn't result in other people continuing to participate. Do you kind of see? So that's a piece of it, right? Especially in the example that you were giving where it sounds like these were issues that were happening between perhaps white students, I'm not sure, but then the students that were then going after the gay students were Hispanic, right? So there's a race dimension to that, where then Hispanics are already overrepresented in jail. So I guess it's not something I have an answer for, but it's something I think a lot about, and I think it's an important issue for the queer community to think about how to address violence without continuing cycles of oppression that already exist, or institutions that uphold that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, another question, comment, thought, observation?
Don't be shy.
Yeah, don't be shy. You already had the first person go.
I might be calling you now.
Yeah, that's what I do.
Yeah. All right, let's, great.
Yay.
Yes. Yes, you can.
I was just wondering what struggles you had with your religious beliefs, and how did you find peace with your sexuality and your religious beliefs?
Can I answer that?
Sure, of course.
My first love was, when I was about 16. I mean, my first female love. I had a few males too, But anyway, I was deeply in love with this woman. We were both about 16, and we were Southern Baptists. Now, I became a Southern Baptist because of her, partly. I sang like you wouldn't believe, but I meant it. I really did mean it. And we used to sit in church and, beautiful Prussian, hold hands like this, we were holding hands and everything in church. And one thing I knew is there wasn't anything wrong with how we felt, because I loved her. And God wouldn't think it was awful. I knew that, and I was luckily saved by having that by having that worldview, because otherwise I would have had been, other people in the church probably would have not said what I said or thought what I thought. But I also thought it was really stupid. I did a certain amount of art, and I used to argue with the Sunday school teacher because she said we shouldn't paint nude models, only, flowers and dogs and things. And I knew that was, in other words, I was able to have my own worldview aside, and that's what I've done consistently. I never agreed with that. It's stupid.
So for me, I was raised up National Baptist.
Yeah.
And I say that with distinction, because people say you're black in the South, you're Southern Baptist, but there is, one of the largest denominations is the National Baptist, which is almost exclusively African American.
Right.
And most people, we kind of get washed over between the, the Northern and the Southern American and the Southern.
Well, and this split is because of racism.
Right. So I grew up very fundamental, and as and we're religious, and as I went through this whole period of having these thoughts, I believed if I prayed hard enough, and if I went to church and I was religious enough, I would be redeemed. Because in traditional religions, and you hear this a lot now, you can be forgiven for murder, but not for being a homo. And I moved to Wisconsin, and I went to Mount Zion Baptist Church, traditional pastor, Reverend Joe Dawson. And I noticed something which I'd known before, but I had never really paid that attention because I was an adult on my own. Well, after the choir law, I thought, God, if the gay people left the choir law, there'd be nobody in the choir, so that 2 or 3 little old ladies up there. The musicians, and dang. And so, as I came out, I found a really accepting community. I was, as I said, I was very, very active. The assistant pastor was the chairman of the Human Rights Commission, and as we did the gay rights struggle, he was there behind us. And during that time, there's a part A and part B to this. Let's see. You talk about the women's movement. I was a national leader for the men's movement. There was a partnership in that. So I was the gay leader for several years, and so I was doing all this stuff. And that's how I got real comfortable around being around. So I could hide as a men's activist, which I wanted until I came to have the gay community. And then I worked in the St. Paul campaign. And Troy Perry, who's the founder of Metropolitan Community Church, was there, and he spoke. And then I heard him a couple more times in San Francisco, and did some communication with him. And I never, after that point, when I moved to San Francisco, I stopped going to church when I moved to Sonoma County because I didn't find a church home. But I always had a strong faith, and I knew that the God I served was a loving God, and created me in his, her own image, because my God is all genders and all races. It's not some white-haired guy with a beard. And so my faith has always been strong. And so when I came, I've always accepted that. And at some point I just said, you know, God made too many of us for this to be wrong. And see, but also I had the benefit of growing up black during segregation, where being black was a sin. And we were rejected by God by race. Because the white-dominated church, you know, had done this. Jerry Falwell's church was 50 miles from my house. It was on the radio. So I was a civil rights activist. So at some point I just said, you know, I have to let go of all this crap that man has imposed upon a supreme being that treated women as second class. And I grew up at a time when the child was disabled, it was considered, it was born disabled, it was a punishment from God for something the parents did that they didn't know that they did. So I grew, the world I grew up with was this world where there was a limited number of people. You had to be white, heterosexual, male, and able-bodied to be okay. And everybody else was condemned to sin of some sort. And there's this angry, ferocious God who hated everybody he created. And I'm thinking, damn. And when I started to embrace a loving God, an omnipotent God, who didn't create a planet to punish us for being born, then my gay issue became a non-issue. You know, and because I did read. And when I began to read, you know, people talk, well, Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, Sodom and Gomorrah is about, not about homosexuality. It's about unjust. It's about not loving. It's not showing hospitality. And when I sat there and read it, I'm thinking, how could somebody, if it takes a grain of sense to get the real meaning out of this. A grain of sense. You know, and if you look at all this, you know, if you look back to the Old Testament, and you know, there's like a dozen anti-gay things in there. But also talks about wearing red, talks about eating this, it talks about that. And you know, we somehow have negated, we allowed religion to negate all of that, to siphon out less than 1/2 of 1/2 of 1/2 of 1/2 of 1% that we're going to hold on to. I said, you know, this is craziness. Because I also, in my studies, I started reading about the history of the Bible, the history of religion, and stuff of this nature. So I now go to Glide Memorial Church in San Francisco, which is the most liberal Methodist church in the universe, which practices unconditional love. We are large, we are Afrocentric, and 53% white. Say amen, somebody. It's about 30% gay, lesbian, trans, and there are people who are freely spiritual, who can be whom they are, whatever that are may be. Dianne Feinstein and her husband are supporters of the Church of the Board. Maya Angelou holds membership. And there are people who come off the food line. This is the church that has almost close to 100 social service programs. We don't have a big building to look nice for 2 hours a week. With all the money goes in. I think this is where I began to really practice love. You know, because part of what the Glide philosophy is, everybody's in need of recovery from the wreckage that people have tried to mold us into not accepting ourselves. So for me, the whole spiritual, yes, it was a struggle for a time. That's a part of the journey to get me to where I am now. To know that I have a higher power who is my rock, who lives through me, and me through the higher power. So I can preach on because I've been saved, sanctified, and born again. But it has, but I think whomever, part of what religion has done is taught women to not self-love. And it's taught gays and lesbians and trans not to self-love. And that's not the Christ that I serve. Because Christ came to redeem us, to free us from all that garbage. And to accept that, And if you want to know about religion, there's a great book out by Reverend Carlton Pilson, who was a Church of God in Christ. He's called before they rebelled. It's called The Gospel of Inclusion. It's a wonderful book because it's from a very conservative theologian that talks about the freedom to self-acceptance and to have that we've been blessed with love and so forth and fulfillment. So yeah, so I'm very spiritual. When I'm home, you'll find me. I don't own a car anymore. I take a bus 2.5 hours each direction to go to church.
Wow.
You know, but I also know that I can have church anywhere I am. I'm probably about 2/3 gospel. And sometimes I get sanctified in airplanes, but you want to see that. So yeah, so how I come to deal with that, it's been part of the journey.
Yeah.
You know, it's been a fulfilling journey. And so when people tell me, you know, I was in Atlanta a couple years ago for a gay pride, and somebody came to me and said there was some anti-gay. I looked at him and said, I'm saved, sanctified, I'm born again. He said, well, you can't be that. I said, who named you God? Who are you to tell me what I can and cannot be? Did God ordainate you to be her spokesperson? But she didn't like that pronoun either.
I want to ask you two those questions.
Sure.
Like, how do you see where things are going, or what have you experienced?
Okay. Well, I live in San Francisco and I work up here, and so I feel in some ways a disconnect from. I think this is part of what a lot of my generation of professors, and I think staff members as well. It's not that much more affordable to live up here than it is down there, and I think a lot of professors live in either the East Bay or in San Francisco now, and so the social life and community that connects the campus to the larger community of the area, I feel like I'm not a part of that, and so and I feel like a lot of people in our generation are not a part of that generation cohort of hires, and I think that's in some ways very sad. It really disconnects what's happening in women's and gender studies, for example, from what's happening in the community. And when you were talking about the ways in which, how generative women's studies was in terms of making these connections, and even just the connections between Santa Rosa Junior College and Sonoma State, I don't have those connections. I never made those connections. And so, I mean, speaking with sort of humility and self-reflection, I can say that I think there are some real structural challenges to where we are now in terms of if women's and gender studies and queer studies are committed to genuine social transformation, and if social transformation starts right here, right now, in the local communities in which we live in and work in, that social transformation becomes a much greater challenge. And so I think I'm so thrilled that I get to be a man working in women's and gender studies. I don't necessarily mark that as progress for the department, but I don't think it's not progress either. It's not some narrative of downfall that we've abandoned our focus on women and women's studies. But I do think that, and I do think it's exciting that we have as much queer studies stuff as we do on campus. But I'm not particularly convinced that culturally we have as much transformative potential now as women's studies did in 1973.
So I've been at Sonoma State for 5 or 6 months so far, so I can't speak with a wealth of, although I was here as an undergraduate earlier, so maybe taking that as a longer trajectory. I think that for myself as a new faculty member, I think something that I'm currently negotiating, this is self-revealing, is really about coming out to my students or coming out in my classes, which I do and I don't do. So I'm trying it in some and not trying it in others and seeing how that goes. And then I speak at things, or I come to things, or I include myself in the we when I talk about gay people, and then some people get it and some people don't. think that, but that's something I'm trying to negotiate. I really appreciate both of you sharing your experiences of coming out to supervisors, because in a sense, I think that it's something that I negotiate as a young professional, trying to understand, I want tenure, and I want to be accepted within the institution, but I don't want to have to compromise who I am. And so it's really helpful to have these kinds of conversations. And I want to be that type of mentor for my students, because I know when I was a student here and I was coming out, and I was alternately terrified and so defiant at the same every moment. And I didn't really know any out people, and it would have made such a difference to me if I had seen, I knew some out people, I went to the bars, but I didn't know anybody that wasn't at a bar, that maybe had just graduated high school, which is fine, but I knew I also wanted to go to graduate school. I was trying to find somebody who could mirror back to me who I was. So I'm negotiating what my potential is with that. So that's something, in my hope for the future, is that personally, I hope I'm able to negotiate that more.
Can I just say something to that? It's moving back in the conversation a bit, but when I was at Sonoma State, I was very out because we were teaching these classes and doing all this crap. So I go to my next school. That was part of the shock of going there, and I had written in there that in my vita that I had taught women, identified women, and all this. That's basically saying, I'm a lesbian. Plus, I took my partner. We had children, and there were some incredible people there who were pretty academic, stuffy people who invited us over for a whole thing to meet other faculty people. I give them stars for the rest of their lives for having done that, because it made it feel normal and regular and all that. However, what happened is, of course, we started off with all this stuff. I was sitting on the, we used to sit on the floor in classes, in a circle and all this sort of stuff. I would be sitting on the floor, and these students in my new school are sitting in chairs, and I'm saying something's wrong. But anyway, I told them I'm going to tell this story because it's pretty compelling. I had given them Ruby Fruit Jungle to read, and we were talking about lesbians, and this one student who was about 20 had seen a television program about lesbians and gay men, and there was a woman and a man there talking about being gay, and she started answering questions to the other students about what it was to be gay. And see, the students don't know. And also there's all this heterosexual assumption, and they're not just like that. They assume that you're straight. If they can't tell, you're not going to sign. And anyway, this conversation went in where one student was asking another student, well, what are they like, and what do they do, and all this kind of stuff. And I said, wait, stop. Okay, I can't do this anymore. I'm lesbian or I'm gay. I can't remember which I said because at that time. And I said, not only that, I can answer your questions. I'm happy to answer your questions. I've studied and read a lot about it because I almost wrote my dissertation when I was here at Sonoma State, writing for Berkeley. I was going to do my dissertation on accounting and disclosure among lesbians. Interview Sonoma County lesbians, which I knew a lot of at the time. Now, accounting means how do you explain why you're a lesbian? Okay, that's what it meant to me in the sociology that I was doing. Disclosure is who do you tell? Do you tell your, obviously your lover, you would know, but
hope so.
Friends, are you out at work? That's the kind of thing I wanted to. I thought it would have been a great dissertation actually at the time. And accounting would be, do you think that you're being sinful? Do you think you've got a psychological problem? Or would be I had about 4 different sort of assumptions I was going to try and see if I could follow up on. Or is it like, I call it an existential choice. Like, is it that you choose? And that's something I'm still arguing with people about. Some people are going, oh yeah, it's genetic, and other people say, no, it isn't. And there's really good research on both sides. That whole thing is not settled as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Well, I was also going through a court case, a custody case at the same time, and I decided not to do that because I couldn't handle it in every single part of my life. So when I went up there, it was very odd because I was out to the administration and most of the faculty, but not necessarily to the students, and I started backing off with the students because one of the students in that class I had the students keeping journals at the time, and honestly, she's a snipe. I remember her name even too, but you don't need to know. She talked to me a lot. I'm real involved with my students. I always have been, and talk to them a lot, and get them to do their thing and everything. And she wrote, Amanda Briggs, that's her name. She wrote in her journal, my God, I found out, people die. I found out today my teacher is a fag. I mean, not only is that outrageously ignorant, but it's like, and I was so shocked and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, do I want to do this? Do I want to put my, and then I had another class where it was women in health, and I brought my partner to talk about being a lesbian mother. We had 3 children, but they were her children. And the questions they asked were so utterly, I just decided I can't do this.
Yeah.
And that's my girl before swine, so to speak. And that doesn't mean I didn't like my students. I just thought, I didn't feel any support there among other faculty or people in the community, so that I felt like, I'm going to be here, someone say whatever. And then later on, because remember, I was there 26 years, I had this wonderful colleague who's about 20 years younger than me, and we taught feminist research. We had a feminist research seminar that was just great. And one time she said, Anne, they need you to talk to them. They admire you so much, and they love you, and they need you to be open with them. And so I started forcing myself back. But it isn't true that once you come out, that you're always out. You can come back if you start getting too much shit.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yeah. It was interesting.
Yeah.
When you talk about students, during that period, I think when I was less, I'm just me, I don't announce it. I do panels, but I don't walk around, and, if you ask, I'm denying. But I think most people know, but I'm surprised some people, every year, about this time of year, because the CSAs will usually say to the ROCs, did you know Joe was gay? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, how long have you been here? A few of them will, but I remember a situation, probably 15 plus years ago. I was at Santa Rosa Inn, which was then a gay bar, and an African-American woman who had been a resident, and still the town where I was, I know all these people. And I was out one night, and she was there, and I'm like, oh shit. Just because in most cases, cities where you have a gay bar, it's like the best place to dance. And since there's so few dance places here, students shut down. Oh my God, here we go. And she came to me, she hugged me, and she said, you never really talked about it, but I didn't you worry? It was something comfortable just to know that you were there. And I never talked to you about it, but I knew that I always could if I needed to. And that made and I've had other students who have said, I never talked to you about it, but just knowing that you were there was somehow, and actually I just got an email like 2 days ago from a former CSA who wasn't gay, and everybody thought he was gay, and he wasn't gay. He's gay now. He said, me and my woman come in and said, can we come see you? And I thought, and so I think what I've learned from media evolution has been very similar, is that have I lost some heterosexual students because of my sexuality? Yes. Have I lost some white students because I'm African American? Can't change that. Can't hide that, Much as I try to put some bleach on, it still won't go away. But I also know that there are people, there have been students and staff members who needed to know that there are people who were okay with being who we were. And it's been true for me professionally. For the Housing Association, I'm the founder of the gay group. And at a time when very few housing, so I just came back a couple weeks ago from from the National Associated Colleges of ACPA, about 4,000 people there. It's never been nicknamed KCPA. I can remember 30 years ago, this is not my primary association, but there were almost no out gay people, and now they're everywhere. And sometimes some of the old veterans say, see what you did? But I'm thinking, all these young people now who don't have to worry as much as I did 30 years ago. So there's a legacy I have. So I think for people, for me, but for me, the students who yeah, there's gonna be shit coming. Come on, I can handle it. I was born black in the South. I'm used to shit.
Right.
I cuss a lot too. My mom, if she was alive, she'd smack me. Go, better than that in public. But for me,
well, I was born white in Alaska, but I can still.
You were still pretty at work, okay? But for me, I've had professionals come up to me and go, just having you as an out person who speaks up helped me do it. Some of them, and so I think for me, the reward for me has come to that place. And I with my own struggles, whether come out to I used to teach classes and we don't have to say it, and that's like, I'm not that long from retirement, I can retire if I want to. So there was a place where I got tenure as an administrator, as a staff member, never became an administrator, so I don't have tenure anymore, but they know. But I think we all know that process, and I say to people, make choices that don't hurt you. Because you can always come out the day if you got a tenure letter. Hey.
Why don't we try to take one more question? We're about that time, right? Yeah.
Okay, this is sort of.
Do you want to come up and talk to the microphone? Would
But
you mind?
she's not that shy because she's way out.
And well accessorized.
Okay, so this is sort of similar to the question I was asked before, but I was curious, in terms of the Queer Straight Alliance on campus, what sort of changes or additions would you like to see in terms of student activity?
I can certainly answer that. I would like to see it much more visible on campus. I would like to see a lot more partnership with women's and gender studies around public programming. It would bring regular queer film series to campus that would generate dialogues that were not simply about either having to mobilize when there's some sort of political crisis or about internal socializing, but about broadening. If it's really a queer straight alliance, like let's bring a lot of amazing things about queer culture onto this campus and make it open for everyone on this campus to experience. Because I think there's a lot of really incredible queer art and culture and conversation that would really broaden and expand and make this campus I think a lot more interesting for everyone. And I would love to see students lead, and I would love to be supportive of and help engineer that if I felt like the QSA has never approached, and I've only been here for a couple of years, so I'm not some diva that needs to be approached, but the QSA has never approached me and been like, hey, let's do something. Like I've always had to go to the QSA.
For me, I think this year would be our third rainbow graduation. Cleve Jones was here for the first one, by the way. And I think what I like to see is the group do more things to, we have queer students in orientation age, but make sure there's a present during orientation. And you let them know it may not come to the table during orientation. Just having students and their parents know that it's here so that we can be found. I know that they had the largest reception this fall that we've had in years. But I think again, I tend to, the presence is finding ways to really integrate into the program. I think the group has gotten, Julie Grayhouse is a great advisor, and she's working individually with a lot of students. I would say that the whole finding places to program, Black History Month, being sure that there are programs about African American, gays, lesbians, trans, that are under the agenda. We talked about that a little earlier. For the other cultural months, being sure that there's because I think for many communities of color, we still see the whole gay, lesbian, bi, trans, queer as being white. And yet, in all of the cultures, there are strong contributions that people of color who have intersex with sexuality have done, and even like the Black Instrument having a conversation about the question somebody asked me about religion and sexuality, being a Black person, and how, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions of what, if you're African American, what it means to be out. There's a whole segment of Black churches now that are just queer centered. My friend Jamie Washington is one of the leaders. He's my son. Not birth son, but he's like gay family. He's my son. But I'm saying, but there's lots of things. To me, it was either how do you intersect? We talk about intersection, but how do you intersect with the other programs that you're doing, studies there? Being sure that if we're doing something, trying to, I think it comes from the students to push when we talk about what businesses do, that we be sure that we talk about queer and lesbian businesses and whatever those other series. So really kind of infusing, because one of the things I wrote down about the future, I think we still isolate queer issues on this campus, like women's and gender studies, and we don't infuse them in many other places.
Yeah. But I just want to make sure we have time for the two of you. This is a great sort of closer question. So, do the two of you want to go ahead?
I'm just going to put it back at you and ask you what you would like to see from us, from the Queer Straight Alliance, or other folks in the room that maybe could speak to that too for yourself.
Well, I just mostly like just communication back and forth. I was an officer this year. I'm actually going to be president next year, so just I guess the communication in the departments.
Yeah, you have a strong
I got your back.
ally for the gender studies.
Also making the club a bigger place for trans students and allies also, and men, because we have like no men, two. So bigger place for allies and trans students.
Great.
Well, I was just going to add in a more general way, this whole idea of allies is so important because, when we were talking much earlier about people not wanting to have anyone know that their children or their anybody in their family's gay because it might reflect on them, it's that whole notion that everything rubs off and they become somehow, outcast as well. And when the more straight people feel comfortable and can have the guts to be allies, the more gay people can have the guts to be who they are, and the more that straight people can have the guts not to be afraid that that's going to hurt them. That's all good. That's a really good thing. That's what I think.
Well, and also I forgot to include making it a safer place for closeted students also, so there's a sort of confidentiality, so we're not running around being like, oh, I saw so-and-so, you can't say.
Well, that's why I think it's so important, to have have a powerful, visible presence for things like this, because while if I were closeted, I would probably have this narcissistic paranoia that I would think that if I came to this, that everyone, it would somehow in the universe would implicate me as gay, right? But I don't assume that anyone in this room is gay, right? Myself. So
I know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm actually going to make an assumption. Higher road.
You don't tell anybody.
Yeah. No, but the more that we do this kind of programming, the more people who are at wherever they are can tap into the amazing things that queerness is without having to put some sort of name or label on where they are in that story.
Could I say one little more thing?
One little more thing. Let's close it out.
This goes back to what I said originally about not being able to make a statement about all lesbians. There are an awful lot. I'm not talking about college now. I'm talking about the general world. There are all kinds of lesbians who don't have a connection to a lesbian community.
Sure.
I used to get annoyed because people say the lesbian community, and they have an idea of these people who hang out in particular ways with each other and start to know each other and feel supported. But there are a lot of people who aren't necessarily, they have their little connections with their little cliques, their little groups of people. But if it were all okay in the same way that, that's why that marriage thing is so important, because it says that that you're valid, that you're legitimate, no matter whether you're in a particular subcultural community or not. You know what I mean? I'm not putting that below.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's, I see that as a very, very wonderful opening kind of thing.
Yeah, great.
I hope.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you all for